Walk up, walk out, walk into the wilderness. If your legs shake, go slow. If you wonder how you will get there, just look for a next step. If you don't even know where there is that you're getting to, take one rock and place it on another. And remember,
Good morning, King Cove. It's good to see you all. My name is Pastor Corey. Shout out to my high schoolers out there. You guys awake still? Still with me? Hey guys, good news for you. I know you've been up all night. Today's sermon, no longer than 90 minutes, okay? So just hang in there. We'll get through it together, all right? All right, so today we conclude our series in the book of Exodus, and we are looking at Joshua 3, beginning in verse 14, going through chapter 4, verse 9, and it reads like this. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space, where heaven and earth meet. Amen. Well, as we come to this Sunday, we are finishing a couple of journeys simultaneously. We're finishing our journey through the book of Exodus that we've been on for the last 8 weeks. We're finishing our journey through Lent, although depending on which tradition you're from, Lent does not officially end until either Maundy, Thursday, or Holy Saturday, next Saturday. But we are entering Holy Week, a different kind of journey. And so we want to remember, and I want to just say as we conclude this, obviously we have done a very kind of high flyover of the Exodus, right? We've spent 8 weeks, 8 themes from the Exodus, but we have not done a deep dive on this. Obviously you could spend a really long time exploring all that happens here, and we've just skipped from the golden calf, which is about 3 months into the journey, all the way into the crossing the Jordan into the promised land. So 40 years, basically, right? But we've looked at different themes from the beginning of this move of God to liberate his people from Egypt and to bring them into the promised land. Now, one of the things that's kind of amazing when you think about it is that we know, because we've spent most of our time at the very beginning of this story, that the Israelites don't have a great track record of following instructions, right? God will do something. He will be very clear about what they should do and what they should not do. They will do the exact opposite, and thus they spend 40 years in the wilderness. So in some ways, it is quite a remarkable thing that the Israelites have made it 40 years without doing something else to screw it up before they get to cross into the promised land, right? But as we know from, if you're familiar with the story, none of that original generation, including Moses, except for Joshua and Caleb, are crossing into the promised land, right? As a consequence for their disobedience with the golden calf. And so we know all of these things, and we come to this final move in this part of the journey. This is the other thing that strikes me about this. So often we can read these stories and think, oh, they're finally going to be in the promised land, and then everything will be great. Until you read the book of Judges, or you read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, or you look at that whole issue, right, of, well, God, we really need a king. God said, no, you don't want a king. No, we really need a king. God said, it's not going to work out so good for you. You shouldn't have a king. And then on this journey goes, right? So that destination, that final destination, is never really the final destination. But in order to cross into this promised land, this land flowing with milk and honey, they have come to the Jordan. It is on the eve of Passover. The symbolism here should not be lost on us. They've come to a river that in the spring, which is the first harvest, is at flood stage. And it is flowing hard. And the water is moving fast. And there is no way for them to get across. It is impossible. There's no way that they can get through this obstacle. And it strikes me that we find ourselves often in life coming up to a certain point in our journey, and moving forward seems impossible. Like, one of the things that never ceases to astound me as I continue through the years and get, higher numbers that I celebrate every year on my birthday, one of the things that, just never kind of ceases to amaze me is nobody really told me, and maybe, probably I wouldn't have been able to understood anyways, but how hard it is, how hard life is, just everyday life. And that's not even talking about, obviously we don't find ourselves in Ukraine or Sri Lanka or some of these other places where there's horrible things happening. Just everyday life is plenty hard, right? And there have been plenty of times when you come through a long journey and you get to where you think you can see the end, and right in front of you is a raging river. And how in the world are you going to get across it? How is this going to happen? And one of the things I love about this story is the way this unfolds, because I think it is really how life works. As we read, we know that the priests take up the Ark of the Covenant, and the water continues to flow until their feet hit the water. right? It is not until they actually step into that obstacle that the water stops flowing. In other words, obedience precedes God's action. Obedience in this case precedes God's action. They've been given very specific instructions. I don't know about you, but I imagine as a priest, Joshua comes to them and says, okay, guys, this is the way it's going to work. Earl, you're going to take this corner. Joe, you're on the other corner. You're going to lift up the ark. You're going to walk into this raging river. I'm not feeling so hot about that, right? But that's exactly what happens. They take up the ark, they listen to the instructions that God has given them, and as they step into the river, the waters stop. And it tells us that all of Israel crossed on dry land. One of my theological heroes is the scholar Walter Brueggemann, and he says this about the entry into the promised land. He says, entry into the land of promise depends on readiness to trust the promise and equal readiness to run great risks for the sake of the promises. Readiness to run great risks for the sake of the promises. Isn't that true? Don't we find that to be true in our own lives? That it's not until we're willing to risk, to run some risks, to see God move in our lives, that we actually experience deliverance, that we actually experience the fulfillment of God's promises. And I'm not saying that it's up to us, that somehow our activity, motivates God to do something. I'm just saying that God calls us into obedience to form us, and then in the midst of that formation, He does what He does. We have to sometimes be ready to run great risks to enter into the land of promise. So friends, wherever you find yourself today, I hope that if you find yourselves on the banks of a flooding river that seems impossible to cross, you will remember that oftentimes it's taking that first step in obedience to what it is that God is calling you to, what it is that God is perhaps beating you over the head about, what it is that perhaps God is just, kind of gently nudging you towards. Whichever place you find yourself, you might not find that entry until you get your feet wet. And then something interesting, and I love this about this story. So that first section that we read at the end of chapter 3 tells us about this crossing and how the river stopped when they stepped into it and everybody crossed over on dry land. And then the second part that we read has to do with God wanting to make sure, as He has all through this story, and as He will all through the rest of the story, wants to make sure that there are some markers in place. Some markers in place that remind us of the story. That remind us, that serve as a memorial, as a memory, as a monument, as an Ebenezer, right? If you like the old hymns, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer," that's what that is. It's a memorial. It's something to remind us to tell the story of what God has done. And the amazing thing that happens when we do that is that by telling that story, we then not only remember, but in some way we are participating in that very story. That is the power of retelling what God has done. It invites us into that specific act. It invites those who hear or see that memorial to participate and remember in what God has done for them. So what are our memorials? What are our piles of stones? Where are our Ebenezers? Well, our memorials, the big ones in the church, are the sacraments. The sacraments of communion and baptism, through which we are invited to participate in the story of God's deliverance of us and of his people through time, right? We celebrate the sacrament of communion twice a month here at Kent Cove, and in that we are rehearsing that great story of Jesus coming and bringing liberation and bringing healing and wholeness and forgiveness and mercy and his kingdom to bear on this broken and hurting world. And every time we participate in that sacrament, we're rehearsing that story, and we're participating in that story, and we're receiving the grace and the mercy and all that God has for us in that memorial. Same with baptism. When we celebrate baptisms together and people are marking their new life in Christ, or we are welcoming an infant into the family of God, we are celebrating that God is doing something in our midst. And we're telling that story over and over again. But here's the thing about memory. You know, God commands throughout this whole journey that Israel remember, right? Remember that they're commanded to keep the Passover, not just on that first Passover when the angel of death came over Egypt, but from then on, right? Even to this day, as we approach Holy Week, Orthodox Jews and Reformed Jews all throughout the world are going to gather and celebrate Passover and remember what it is that God has done. And so memory is vital for us, because without it we cannot have hope. But the question that is really important as we think about how do we remember these things, the stories and the activity of God that the memorials point us to, how do we hold them? Do we hold these memories as something to get back to? As some great golden era in time when we need to recapture and go back to, or as something that informs our journey as we continue to move forward with God and his action in the world today? You see, we can hold on tightly and thus become stuck and rigid and just really difficult to live with, to be honest, if we look at these memorials as something that we have to get back to those good old days when God did this and that and the other thing. You know, one of the lessons that I learned early as a pastor is I would hear a lot of people talking about the good old days in whichever church I was serving. Oh, I remember when we were this and we were that and we were the other thing and we built this building. And the you know, one of the stories I heard with a lot of the smaller churches was, you know, how people in the church would take out second mortgages on their home to build this church. And so but the problem is the way it was being remembered was not that taking that risk to see where God is going to move us next, that those people were doing, not emulating that, but saying, well, we can't change the covering on the pews because people mortgage their homes to put those pews in, right? Wrong message. That's not risking something to move into that new territory that God is calling us to. That's memorializing something in an unhealthy way. So friends, memory is vital for hope to exist. We as individuals, as a congregation, as communities, as nations, we must remember those seminal events that form our lives and our collective memories. The people of Israel needed to remember that when they finally got up to the river Jordan and God was going to bring them into the promised land, they needed to be reminded that it was God who did these things. And so they built a memorial. And we too need to build memorials to those events where we have seen God move. The Israelites were to remember and participate in the Exodus event through celebrating Passover year over year, rehearsing God's deliverance, which then gives them hope. And if you go and you celebrate the Passover with Jewish people, you will hear that hope when in the process of celebrating that meal, that Passover meal, the one phrase that you will hear that is filled with hope is when they say, next year in Jerusalem. Next year in the Promised Land. Right? And so it's this reminder that God has done something before, and we long for that day when He will bring us where He is bringing us next. The Israelites entering the Promised Land were to erect a monument that would remind them of God's fulfillment of the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey. We, as followers of Jesus, live in a period of history where we can choose the certitude of old practices and beliefs and try to get back to that golden age that once existed, or maybe actually didn't exist, because memory can be a tricky thing, right? You know what I'm talking about. You ever gone back to your elementary school? Right? This place that looms large, and then you go and the chair doesn't even come up to your knee. Memory can be a tricky thing. And wanting to go back can actually, instead of bring life, bring death. So we can choose the certitude of old practices and beliefs, or we can trust that the Spirit is guiding us into a new reality. But in order to experience that new reality, we, like Israel, on the banks of the flooding Jordan River, must first get our feet wet. As Dr. Brueggemann asks, what are you willing to risk to enter into that promised land? Friends, these are all important questions for us to wrestle with as we enter into Holy Week. You know, there's all kinds of opinions about being liturgical or being this or that or the other thing, or why do we celebrate Holy Week? The reason we celebrate Holy Week is to actively remember, to participate, and by participating, be reminded of the events leading up to Easter. Which is why we gather on Maundy, Thursday, and we celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's Supper just as Jesus did with His disciples on that Holy Thursday. We gather on Good Friday and we remember the events by walking the stations of the cross and experiencing, at least in a very small way, what Jesus Himself experienced on His journey to the cross. And then we gather on Resurrection Sunday to celebrate that the tomb is empty. But we don't jump right to the empty tomb. We participate in the events of Holy Week in order to prepare our hearts for that resurrection. Friends, it is my hope that as we enter this Holy Week that you will be reminded, that you will see memorials along the way that will remind you of those places where God has acted in the past. But that your response will not be to try to get back to some bygone era, but to remember that God is calling you to step out in faith into a new reality. That, friends, is the journey of faith. Amen.